Security is a promise, not a product, not a service in the conventional sense, a promise that someone is watching, that someone is present, that the building you left at 6 p.m. is being looked after by a professional who knows what they're doing and is where they're supposed to be. The client signs a contract. The contract specifies coverage: 8 officers per shift, 4 shifts a week, 2 locations. The client reads those numbers and feels something, not quite peace of mind, but the organizational equivalent of it. The liability is transferred. The risk is managed. Someone else is responsible for what happens in the dark. What the client cannot see, what no client ever sees, is whether those 8 officers exist, whether they are trained, whether they are present, whether the shift that was invoiced is the shift that was staffed. The client pays for a promise. The only person who knows whether the promise was kept is the person who made it. In this case, across 4 client sites, the promise was being kept for 5 people out of every 8. The other 3 were ghosts. My name is Daniel Rowe, and this is the case where the most dangerous gap wasn't in the accounts, it was in the building. The client was a woman named Renata Bosch. She owns Citadel Security Partners, a mid-sized contract security firm operating across the greater Atlanta metro area. 83 guards on payroll, 14 active client contracts, annual revenue of approximately $6.4 million, a business she had built over 11 years after leaving a regional director role at one of the national security chains. She was 54, direct and precise, with the particular sharpness of someone who has spent a career in an industry where vague answers cost real money. She came to me through her insurance broker, who had flagged an anomaly in a workers' compensation audit, a discrepancy between the headcount Citadel reported to the insurer and the headcount implied by its payroll records. The broker hadn't been able to resolve it. He'd suggested she find someone who could look inside the operation. I have an operations manager named Conrad Voss. He's been with me 7 years. He manages all client contracts, staffing, scheduling, post-assignments, the deployment of guards to sites. He is the person between me and every client relationship on the operational side. I handle business development and the strategic relationships. Conrad handles the execution. And the payroll discrepancy? Do you have a theory? Conrad manages the scheduling system and submits the payroll data to our processor. I review the totals, but not the individual entries. There are 83 names on our payroll. I couldn't tell you all of them from memory. That's what Conrad is for. 83 names, a payroll processor who receives data from Conrad, an owner who reviews totals but not individual entries, a scheduling system that Conrad manages without independent review. I asked Renata how client contracts were structured, specifically how the number of guards per shift was determined and billed. The contract specifies coverage. Client says they need 8 guards at their facility during a given shift window. We agree on that number, we staff to that number, we invoice against that number. Conrad matches the staffing to the contract requirements. And if a guard calls in sick, if the actual staffed number is below the contracted number on a given shift, how is that handled? Conrad arranges a replacement, or he notifies the client and we provide a credit on the invoice. That's standard. Standard, unless the gap between contracted coverage and actual coverage isn't occasional and accidental, unless it's structural and deliberate, unless the people missing from the shift were never scheduled to be there at all. This time, my name was Daniel Webb, HR compliance auditor, background in workforce management for service companies, headcount verification, scheduling accuracy, labor law compliance. The kind of engagement a security firm with 83 employees might commission to verify that its scheduling practices met state licensing requirements. Conrad Voss was told the audit was routine. Renata framed it as preparation for a client renewal with one of Citadel's largest clients, which required third-party HR documentation. Conrad Voss met me at Citadel's operational headquarters on a Monday morning. He was 46, broad-shouldered, efficient in his movements, with the manner of someone who manages people in the field and has developed a practiced calm around logistical complexity. He shook my hand and produced a binder of personnel files before I asked for them. Organized, cooperative, exactly prepared enough to suggest he'd thought about what a compliance auditor would want to see. The binder contained personnel records for 83 employees, hiring dates, licenses, training certificates, post assignments, everything a guard is required to have under Georgia's Private Detective and Security Agencies Act, the licensing framework that governs the industry in the state. Conrad walked me through the structure. The guards were organized into post teams, each team assigned to a specific client site, each team managed by a shift supervisor who reported to Conrad. I started with the licenses. Every security guard in Georgia is required to hold a valid registration issued by the Georgia Board of Private Detective and Security Agencies. The registration is tied to the individual, not to the company, and is publicly searchable. A license number in a personnel file can be verified against the state database in 30 seconds. I pulled the database on my laptop while Conrad was out of the room. I ran the first 20 license numbers from the binder against the state registry. 17 returned valid registrations with matching names and photos. 3 returned no record at all.
3 license numbers that did not exist in the state database, 3 names in the personnel file with fabricated credentials. I noted them and kept moving. I had 16 more pages of records to check. I spent the rest of day 1 and all of day 2 running every license number in the binder against the state registry. 83 names. The results came back in batches as I worked through the roster systematically, cross-referencing each entry against the public database. 74 returned valid registrations. The names matched, the license numbers matched, the registration statuses were current. Real people, properly licensed, employed by Citadel Security Partners in exactly the roles the personnel file described. 9 did not. 9 license numbers in Citadel's personnel records that returned no result in the state database. 9 names attached to fabricated credentials. I ran each name separately, not just the license number, through the database's name search. 3 of the 9 returned results for real individuals with the same name but different license numbers and different employers. The names in the Citadel file were real names. The license numbers were invented. 9 ghost employees, on a roster of 83, more than 10% of the workforce that existed only on paper. I cross-referenced the 9 names against the scheduling system. Conrad had given me read access to the scheduling database as part of the compliance review. Each of the 9 phantom employees appeared in the schedule, assigned to shifts at 4 client sites, logged as working regular hours, generating timesheet records that fed into the payroll system Conrad managed. They were scheduled, they were paid, they were never at the sites. But I needed to verify the physical side. Database analysis tells you what the records say. It doesn't tell you what actually happened at 2 a.m. at a client's distribution facility when the shift roster said 9 guards were present. I needed to visit the sites. I visited 3 client sites over 4 days. I framed the visits as part of the HR audit, verifying that post assignments in the personnel files matched the actual deployment of staff. Conrad accompanied me to the first site. I went to the second and third alone, having established that independent site visits were standard practice for the compliance documentation the client renewal required. The first site was a regional distribution center for a logistics company, a client that contracted for 9 guards per shift across a 24-hour operation. I arrived at 9 a.m. with Conrad. The day shift was on. I counted 8 guards present and accounted for. One of the 9 scheduled was logged as sick. Conrad had a replacement scheduled for the afternoon. The site looked properly staffed. The second site I visited at 11 p.m., a corporate office campus for a financial services company, 8 guards contracted per shift for overnight coverage. I arrived as a compliance auditor conducting an after-hours site visit. The shift supervisor let me in. I walked every post. 5 guards were present. 3 posts were unmanned. The shift supervisor, a guard who had been with Citadel 4 years, told me that was normal, that they always ran the overnight with 5 on this campus, that Conrad had told them the client had requested a modified coverage arrangement for budget reasons. The client had not requested a modified coverage arrangement. The contract was for 8 guards. The invoice for the previous month showed 8 guards billed at the full contracted rate. The client was paying for 8. 5 were there. The other 3 existed only in the schedule, only in the payroll, only in Conrad Voss's system. The third site confirmed the pattern. A pharmaceutical warehouse, 10 guards contracted, 7 present when I arrived at midnight. The shift supervisor at this site was less forthcoming than the previous one. When I asked about the coverage level, she looked at her phone and said she'd been told to expect a compliance visitor and to answer questions. She answered mine in single sentences. 3 posts were unstaffed. She confirmed that had been the case for as long as she'd been assigned to the site, 14 months. The structure of the scheme was straightforward once the pieces were visible. Conrad Voss controlled the scheduling system. He assigned guards to shifts and sites. He also submitted the payroll data to Citadel's processor, a weekly file that listed every employee's hours and generated the corresponding payments. He had built 9 phantom employees into the roster, fabricated names, fabricated license numbers that were plausible enough to pass a visual review by someone who wasn't checking them against the state database. Each phantom was assigned to a shift at 4 client sites. Each phantom generated a weekly timesheet. Each timesheet generated a payroll disbursement. The payroll checks for the phantom employees didn't go to home addresses. 3 of the 9 had bank account routing information in the payroll system that I traced, with Renata's authorization, to 2 accounts at a credit union in Marietta, Georgia. Both accounts had been opened in the names of the phantom employees using the same fabricated identities. Both accounts had a single authorized user on the debit card linked to each account, Conrad Voss. The remaining 6 phantom employees had checks listed as physical delivery to a post office box in Smyrna. The P.O. box was rented under a business name, a sole proprietorship called Voss Security Consultants. Conrad had used his own name on the rental, either confident that no one would look or careless in a way that suggests the scheme had run long enough that he'd stopped worrying about the edges of it. 9 phantom employees, 4 client sites, 3 posts unmanned every shift at each site, clients paying flaking rates for coverage that was 30% below what they were promised. The client site invoicing completed the picture. Conrad managed billing as well as scheduling. The invoices went out monthly showing the contracted headcount, 8 guards or 9 or 10 depending on the site, at the contracted hours. The clients paid those invoices without questioning them. Why would they? The coverage looked sufficient to a security director who wasn't counting heads at midnight. The reports they received from Conrad showed the contracted staffing levels because Conrad wrote the reports. He controlled the schedule, he controlled the payroll, he controlled the billing, he controlled the operational reports. There was no point in the information chain where someone independent of Conrad saw the gap between what was billed and what was deployed. I went further into the history than the immediate picture required, partly because the documentation needed to be complete, partly because once you see the shape of a scheme, you want to know how long it has been that shape. The scheduling system retained records going back to Conrad's first year in the role, 7 years. The phantom employees had been introduced gradually. The first appeared in the system 4 years and 3 months before I arrived. A single name, a single post assignment, a single payroll entry. Then a second 8 months later, then 2 more the following year. By the time I was looking at the roster, 9 phantom employees had been built into the system over approximately 3 years. He had grown the scheme slowly, 1 ghost at a time, testing
whether each edition triggered any review, any question, any anomaly that would pull attention toward the payroll. None did. Renata reviewed totals. The payroll processor processed what it received. The insurance carrier audited headcount against the payroll reports, which showed 83 employees, all of them real as far as the report was concerned. The workers' compensation discrepancy that Renata's broker had flagged was the first external signal in 3 years that something in the numbers didn't reconcile. I also looked at the client incident logs. Every security company maintains records of incidents at client sites: thefts, breaches, access violations, anything that occurs during a covered shift and requires documentation. It's both a liability requirement and a client service record. At 2 of the 4 sites running phantom coverage, there had been incidents during the scheme's operating period that occurred at unmanned posts: a warehouse break-in at the pharmaceutical site, 14 months ago, the same period the shift supervisor had told me the understaffing had been in place for, 14 months. Petty theft from a loading dock at the financial services campus. Both incidents were documented in Citadel's records. Both had occurred at posts that the phantom staffing had left uncovered. The clients thought they were protected. They were not. And in 2 cases, the gap between the promise and the reality had been the gap through which something bad had actually walked. The documentation assembled into 5 streams. The license verification: 9 personnel file entries with license numbers